Good evening. My name is Richard Sommer. I'm the Dean of the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce the Frank Gehry Chair event and this evening's speakers. This year, we're extremely fortunate to have Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee of Los Angeles, of the Los Angeles firm Johnston Mark Lee, as our Frank Gehry International Visiting Chairs in Architecture. Named in honor of Frank Gehry, this endowed chair brings a highly recognized internationally notable architect to teach at graduate studio and to deliver a public lecture at the faculty each year. Recent Gehry chairs have included Hervé Nijirk of Croatia, Nadir Tirani and Mitchell Joachim from the United States, and Jose Maria de Churchichaga of Spain. The annual Frank Gehry Chair was established in the year 2000 under the leadership of former Dean Larry Wayne Richards. 45 donors contributed gifts totaling $1 million, and many of those who undertook this fundraising effort and who are contributors to the endowment are in the audience this evening. So I'd like to take a moment to thank them for their generosity and foresight, actually, in providing us with this fantastic chair program. So I'm thrilled that Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee accepted our invitation to be this year's Frank Gehry Visiting Chair, because this has actually been a very busy year for them, and they might not have accepted. In September, they were appointed the next artistic directors of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, the second edition of which is scheduled to take place in the fall of 2017. And for those of you who didn't see the first one last year, it's something not to miss. Earlier this year, a book on the work of their firm entitled House is a House is a House is a House is a House, I got all the houses right, was published by Berkhauser. Described by W Magazine as, quote, the architects of choice for LA creatives, and a firm who are quietly transforming the Los Angeles architecture landscape, which is a pretty heavy-duty landscape, by the way. Johnston Mark Lee's diverse portfolio includes contemporary exhibition designs, Beverly Hills boutiques, and structurally innovative private residences. Current projects include the Mental Drawing Institute on the campus of the Mental Collection in Houston, designed many years ago by Renzo Piano, a renovation of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, which will be completed in the summer of 2017, and the new UCLA Graduate Art Studios campus in Culver City, California. To date, the Office of Johnston Mark Lee has received over 30 major awards. Their work has been exhibited internationally and is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, among other galleries. Now, I want to make a note about tonight's event format. This is actually our poster for this year, which is we're about to receive. They're a little bit late. And this year it'll be another scarf like it was last year. And you can read the titles and upcoming lectures here. The format for this year it comes from a decision we made to take a different approach to our traditional lecture and event formats, to include discussions and debates with the aim of deepening our discourse on pressing contemporary issues in architecture, landscape, architecture, urban design, and art. To this end, each of our major lectures or events this year have been framed with a question. Tonight's question, when do looks matter more than performance, was inspired, in a sense, by the cliche about the need to choose between looks or personality, or what that old Billy Crystal comedic send-up of the actor Fernando Lamas implied when he would say how it is better to look good than to feel good. So tonight we want to try and break down this cliche, at least in architecture, to challenge what might in the end be a false dichotomy between aesthetic aims and technical performance. Because I don't know about you, but I think when we feel better, we actually look better, or when someone or something is really smart or interesting or generous, we tend to see that person or thing as being more beautiful. So having this discussion on the occasion of the Frank Gehry Chair lecture and framing it around the work of Sharon and Mark makes great sense. Gehry's work is infamous for its degree of aesthetic innovation, but he is, in fact, an architect whose work is deeply invested in material experimentation, modern craft, and programmatic invention. That is, his buildings actually perform. Now, for the first time, we have a Gehry Chair from Los Angeles. And Sharon and Mark's work actually follows interestingly in the Gehry tradition, not only because they frequently collaborate with artists, writers, photographers, and sculptors on their projects, but also because, like Frank Gehry, but using different means, they are very canny about the drawings, models, and modes of representation through which they develop their work, and know very well how to play on the difference between images and built things. Like Gehry, they are also conscious of the relationship of their work to particular strains in modernism. Now, after Sharon and Mark's lecture, we will be inviting Michelle Addington, the Hines Professor of Sustainable Architectural Design at the Yale University School of Architecture, to the stage to give a short presentation on the topic of tonight's theme, in a sense, in response to the lecture. Michelle Addington is educated as both an architect and an engineer. Michelle started her career at NASA, testing materials for unmanned spacecraft before turning to architecture. Her work explores the relationships between energy phenomena, and building construction, and she has written extensively on topics such as environmental system design, lighting, energy, and advanced materials. Michelle is the very rare scientist architect who can decipher, scrutinize, and help advance the technical and aesthetic claims of some of our most talented, but sometimes obfuscating architects, distinguishing rhetoric from real possibility. She is asking important questions about what it means for architecture to perform in all the ways that matter. Oops, sorry. From all the ways that matter, from how buildings manage light and temperature to issues of materiality, resource consumption, and endurance over time. After Michelle's presentation, because all of our events this year are a little bit complicated, but this one tonight I think will be particularly focused. So after Michelle's presentation, Professor Robert Levit, the director of our Master of Architecture program, will join Sharon, Mark, and Michelle on stage to moderate a discussion on tonight's topic of aesthetics and performance. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee to this stage.
Thank you, Richard, for the generous introduction, and thank you, Richard and Robert, for the opportunity to teach here at UT. We're really happy to be here, happy to be in this stage with Michelle. We've known Michelle since we were students, admired her work ever since. Particularly, we're thrilled to occupy the Frank Gehry Chair. Frank Gehry is a figure that we have admired and looked towards for a long time, not only because we're from Los Angeles, but he followed such a strong, consistent trajectory. So tonight, instead of just giving a usual lecture to present our work, we wanted to do something different. We wanted to share with you what we see in Frank Gehry's work that are important for us first. And then we show some of our work, and then we can follow up with Michelle's presentation. Just because we're from Southern California, Los Angeles, actually, in the beginning, when I was a student at USC, I didn't really pay much attention to Frank Gehry or the whole Los Angeles school. You know, I was recently talking to Ron Whitty, who also came of age in Southern California, and we said at that time we tried not to look at anyone around us. You know, Frank Gehry, Morphosis, Eric Moss, they were just crazy expressionist guys. You know, we're looking at people from a distance as well as in time. And I remember the time when I first started paying attention to Frank Gehry was a lecture of Aldo van Eyck's, of Team 10, the late Dutch architect who I admired. And at that time, some of you might know, this is in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. He was just finished his house in Amsterdam for single mothers. And he also was very kind of like an angry guy, you know, who was very upset about a certain generation of Aldo Rossi or Michael Graves, who maybe took history in a different way that his generation did to modern architecture. So some of you might know his texts or his lectures called Post and Rats and Other Pests in relationship to postmodernists or rationalists. He was famous for not addressing that group of architects by name. AR, referred to AR for Aldo Rossi, PE for Peter Eisenman and such. So I saw him at MIT and he gave a 2-hour-long lecture. The first hour was about this single project that he finished, spoke beautifully, showed 200 images. And then he said, well, I want to comment on the current state of architecture. And then he quickly turned into this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character, angry guy, criticized everyone, never referred anyone by name, AR, MG, you know, CM for Charles Moore, and never mentioned them. And they said, okay, I'm done. Now I'm going to show my competition projects. And then he turned into this beautiful gentleman, speaking beautifully about his project. And then one project, he showed the site plan, and he said, well, this is the river, this is the cathedral, this is a project by Frank Gehry, this is, and I think he caught himself. So he turned towards the audience and said, some of you might have realized that I just mentioned Frank Gehry by name. So everyone sat back and we thought, here comes the big bomb. And he said, I did it on purpose because I consider Frank Gehry to be a very good architect. That's it. No explanation. And I was stumped. I was like, I never understood. He never explained. And I was thinking then maybe because they shared an affinity with the fine arts, perhaps out of Van Eyck's interest in primitive villages, he saw some of that quality in Gehry. But I never have an answer. But ever since then, I started paying close attention to Frank Gehry's work. And I think for students, of course, you know of his work here in Toronto. And certainly, I think the last 20 years, you know, the general public know of his, like the Foundation Louis Vuitton, the Novartis building in Basel, the Disney Concert Hall, and somehow maybe the last 20 years, for me, it started off at the end, at the completion of the Guggenheim in Bilbao. When he finished this building, I was teaching at the Etihad in Zurich, and I interviewed him about this project. And afterwards, I published the interview, and then I had to write an introduction about him. So at that time, it was a year or two before the Earth Complete book came out. So I was writing the introduction, you know, he had won a Pritzker, won this award, that award, taught at these places, and completed X amount of projects. And I didn't know. So I put 50, 60, big question mark, faxed it to his office. It was fax. Faxed it to his office and got the fax back with a big circle around the number of buildings complete. It was 260 buildings. And I, you know, just was completely flabbergasted by the number because a month before that, I wrote a piece on Le Corbusier. So I pulled out the information. And Corbusier did 70 buildings, including the ones he did as Charles Jeanneret as a teenager. But he also completed 40 books. He headed 3 journals, 100 or so projects. I was just looking at the numbers and I was thinking of the 70 buildings versus Frank Gehry's 260 buildings. That was 1997, 1998. And I was imagining like the amount of important buildings, you know, in Gehry's career. You know, his house, Ron Davis' house, Vitra, Winton Guest House, and the buildings in between. You know, maybe he didn't have the books that Corbusier had, but he had the buildings in between that maybe between one paradigm shift to another, he needed the buildings in between to get from one project to the other. And subsequently, we're not only interested in Gehry as an architect, as a designer, but also his career, the trajectory of his career, and how he modeled that. So this group of work that we've just shown, I think everyone is very familiar with, that really colonized a new type of form. But I think a period that was important for us was another 20 years, I think basically in the 70s and 80s in Gehry's work, when he was in his 40s and 50s. And we want to pick some of the projects that were important to us in that period. This is before that period. This is the Danziger studio that he did for Louis Danziger, the graphic designer for LACMA, did a lot of projects for LACMA. It was a time that Gehry himself, they was very influenced by Louis Kahn, very brutalist, very introverted, blank and brutal boxes finished the way the LA freeways are finished. But already for us, we begin to see like the skylight begin to occupy or begin to approximate a similar volume, a similar dimension that the buildings are. Gehry himself talked about the importance of Kahn in this project for him. And perhaps for us, the Ron Davis house that he did for the artist Ron Davis was a watershed moment for us. This is a single object dealt with perspective or perspectival distortions, a trapezoidal plane, a roof that is tilting from one corner to the other corner. And then inside it's just basically like an urban landscape, these volumes, these bridges that begin to, similar to Ron Davis paintings, like this bridge. And everything is roughly finished. There's a certain kind of choreography that dealt with the volume as well as the circulation inside. This is the Shoreline Aquatic Pavilion that was not finished. Maybe not that known of a Gehry project, but this project was also very important for us, especially in our early work. We see the similarity to the Ron Davis studio with this kind of monolithic pitch, but also at the same time, this courtyard shape is carved in. For us, it's a combination of two different typologies. Could we think about the courtyard or the L-shaped house as a generator, as something that is generated from the bending of a plane, like Zaha Hadid's diagram for Cardiff Bay Opera House, or could we see it as something that is extruded from a volume itself? Another thing that impressed us about Gehry is this contrast between very solid volumes and very fragile volumes. So in this case, it's the Rouse Company headquarters building that he did in Maryland, where you have these very solid forms in stucco, and then there are these fragile wooden canopies that are around. Maybe this one is still a very tame project. I understand that this is a project that Gehry referred to a lot in his early career, in his 70s at least. But I think one can compare to another watershed moment in his career, which is 1978, right around the time that he finished his own house. There were three projects that were, I think, important to him, important to us too, and how that three projects that were not built, but three projects that congealed in Gehry's own house. This is the Wagner House in Malibu, similar to the Rouse Company that we've shown before. This is the solidness of the volume in contrast to the chain link that's around the chain link volume on the right-hand side and the chain link fence on the other. And also, it's almost like a built perspective. For us, it's very similar to the Ron Davis house. But while the Ron Davis house is on a flat plane in Malibu, this one is on a tilting slope. Huh? So in a way, it's part perspective, part axonometric projection, but a built axonometric projection. Also for us, the openings, the irreverence of the openings, cut where the columns are. I think a lot about maybe Eisenman's House 11 or 11 Odd, this kind of constructed axonometric, already kind of present in Frank Gehry's Wagner House. Also, this type of drawing from his office or from him that you don't really see anymore, almost constructing an axonometric and perspective at the same time. A second project is the Gunter House in Encino Hills, where the agglomeration of volumes become more apparent. Frank Gehry, in an interview, called these chain link fence structures ghost structures. So they're almost like shadows of these solid volumes, and then the ethereality of the chain link casts a strong shadow on these solid volumes. And then the chain link became balloon frame in the Vermilion House, also of 1978. Here you begin to see the debris of the balloon frame begins to not only erode the volume, but also extrude and becomes its own volume that penetrates the solid volumes. Please also note the tilted volume on the roof that eventually came back into Frank Gehry's house. So of course the house was built when he was, I believe, 48. Very well-known house, a Dutch colonial house, existing Dutch colonial house that's being wrapped around. You can see mean, just how the stairs are built with a combination of wood construction with concrete on two sides, a combination of an opening in the corner with very standardized windows. So these kind of multiple volumes begins to be compacted within one larger framework. Everything inside, is stripped. The lath, the 2x4s, the plywood is exposed. I particularly, this facade is important for us. On one hand, you see the tilted volume in the Vermilion house of the roof became this tilted cube, but at the same time, you see a certain relationship to the existing roof, or the planes that are built out of chain link. You can see there was moments where vine were planted, almost like sunscreen to protect the glare, the house from glare. An earlier photograph. So one sees the dichotomy between the existing wall of the existing house on the left, and the new wrapper on the vertical surface on the right. And I think this dichotomy also exists between the ceiling, which is really the architecture, versus what happens below, which is very quotidian, very simple kitchen fixtures, very kind of bohemian-like dining tables and director's chair. But I think we learned this from Rafael Moneo, who talked about the brilliance of how Gehry negotiated between the architectural plane on the ceiling versus what is more quotidian in the base, just by demonstrating how the two windows, the design window of the corner meets the standardized window, and how Gehry would use a Ellsworth Kelly print in a metal frame that begins to recall the standardized window, and then the curvature, how it works with this piece and form this negative space. And in many ways, we look at this moment a lot and think a lot of Gehry's brilliance already was condensed in this very simple moment of his own architecture in relationship to an artwork. There you see the special corner window again. And then this type of compactness of these volumes, and also has an urban dimension when it's more exposed. In this case, the Loyola Law School that started in 1981 that's still being built upon. A very rough neighborhood in Los Angeles at that time, very introverted scheme. Pretty much the whole public space inside the campus is organized by this yellow bright building with a series of smaller pavilions in front. I think these moments where the main stair, where there's the typical stair that you need where the landing is, but then a different form on the exterior. So there's a shape that deals with the stair, and then there's an internal shape that deals with the function of the stair. And very simple means. I think these are very simple volumes that Gehry used to build the classrooms and the auditoriums. And it's this more classical phase, but just using concrete columns to suggest something in front. Or another classroom building, which is only a very simple dumb box, but then this is really a skylight that lights the foyer. And so, but the foyer the skylight once again is given the same type of prominence as the building volume itself. And you can also see it in the chapel right next to it with this kind of glass encased campanile and these exposed wood construction. And it's very simply organized. Sometimes it has this axial relationship within the campus, or he uses very simple berms that begins to direct the visual axis and such. I don't know if you see it in this image, but there's a small Klaus Oldenburg sculpture, Klaus Oldenburg and Kosher van Bruggen, this sculpture of this tilted ladder that's on this campus. One of the many collaborations between Gehry and Oldenburg and van Bruggen. This is a later picture. You can see there's another building that's already built here, and then this is a small tower that Gehry invited John Nouvel to come and build this tower attached to his building. Apparently, John Nouvel's first building, which is an attachment, which is really a viewing deck that's attached to a Gehry building that's already built, and then this project is an ongoing project. So the campus continued to grow. So which brings us to this idea of this kind of still life idea of like individual elements coming together. Sometimes they're very far apart. Sometimes they're agglomerated much closer together. 1981, the Indiana townhouses in Venice. Three simple constructions, one cladded in roof shingles, one in plywood, and one in stucco. Gehry used very iconographic, vernacular elements like stairs, fireplaces, or corner windows, and gave them very exaggerated scales to erode the corner of these volumes. But also the windows themselves are exaggerated in scale, so it gives a very strange dimension to these volumes. You're not quite sure. Now the context is much more built up. Right next to it was Dennis Hopper's house, but you can imagine, without much context at that time, you're not exactly sure how big these buildings are because of these exaggerated windows. But inside it's very straightforward. It's no poche. You see the fireplace just becomes a negative and assumes the same type of character as the architectural room of the space. And perhaps the most blatant of this still life way of organizing buildings came in Shire Day, early 80s. The scheme was started in early 80s, where there's a larger building behind, as office building, and then in the front, 2 buildings by Gehry, and Gehry invited Klaus Oldenburg and Kosher van Bruggen to do this gigantic binoculars, which forms as a gateway where one drives through and then enter through the parking garage. I have to say, Richard mentioned this relationship between art and architecture, and I think there's some things that's very smart of Gehry, of almost conceding the most important part of his building to Klaus Oldenburg. But because once he does that, I think he also has more budget to do the 2 buildings next to it. But also, I think it's somehow raising the building beyond the value of real estate to art, which is a different cultural value or cultural capital. The cornice you see on the right-hand side, you see it again in the transformation of a building in Boston, Newbury Street, almost Renaissance-like building missing a cornice, and basically Gehry used the same way to bring out what the building could have been. Even in smaller details, like this is the Edgemont complex from 1988, where there's an elevator core, and the elevator core expands out and creates a frame where this much finer chain link is hung around as shading device. The ghost structure that Gehry talked about earlier in his career, made out of chain link, became something else. And the Edgemont complex, it's actually very well designed and well-placed village of elements within this outdoor shopping area. Very quotidian type of volumes. Some of the existing buildings, like this one, was incorporated. But then there are these ghost volumes, ghost structures. This is a very small store, but it has a really tall height. And he creates this type of glass volume above, or something that is basically just a frame that demarcates this kind of almost San Gimignano type of towering structure that leads one's way into the main space. The still life, there's this period about the fish and the snake. This is the Kobe Fish Dance restaurant. There's a more simpler building behind, and the fish really acts as a sunscreen or sunshade. And then the coiled snake is right next to it. And we see this thematic being done again in the Follies. It's a presentation at the Leo Castelli Gallery, and it exists only as a scheme, but Gehry talked about this being designed as a prison, 2 prisons that could be privately commissioned. And perhaps the last iteration of this duality was in another unrealized project at Art Center up in Pasadena, where there's this well-known museum building by Craig Elwood that bridges over a road. In the 2000s, Frank Gehry designed this library building, which is in the direction of the coiled snake, and also was invited was Alvaro Siza to design a series of new school buildings. And for us, it almost has this kind of fish and snake relationship again, almost like maybe a soul or a flattened fish in relationship to this kind of coiled snake. So at the end of this period of the late 80s, we thought 2 projects that are most important for us in Gehry's career was Winton Guest House, was a a guest house that is in the same property of a Philip Johnson house. Each of the buildings, each of these volumes are individual rooms, kind of like this one-room building being hinged, but just like tenuously. So in a way, it's not interlocked. Each of the volume maintains its own characteristic. And then when it comes together, it forms the house. So the model still was more abstract. It seems like it has only two materials. And the final building, every building was clad in a different material. So in a way, the parts read more than the whole in this case. And also, the way of putting openings into the building. So some of the sculptural quality that the model promised became more architecturalized in the final building. But this was a building that for us is a precursor to Vitra in Waal am Rijn. Also a relationship that, a commission that somehow was related to Klaus Oldenburg when Rolf Feldbaum and his brother commissioned the Oldenburg sculpture for their father. And then there was Nicholas Grimshaw did an existing building and a master plan. Gehry came in and did one more factory building, and then the museum. And then the museum is very simple. It's you can dissect it into a agglomeration of 6 rooms. But the circulation, the stairs, the skylights all begin to adopt this notion of an architectural volume. So you begin to see the agglomeration of these volumes. But for us, I think this building also suggests a new synthesis, a new type of coherence. Different from the Winton Guest House, where each volume is dedicated or cladded with a different material. Frank Gehry decided to clad everything in everything that is straight and leaning in to be stucco, just white. And everything that is leaning out, which means that water will stay longer or becomes roof, in zinc cladding. So it's a different way of thinking about materiality in relationship to the volumes itself. So in a way, it creates a very different a unity. You understand that the parts to whole relationship very differently for us from this kind of still life period. And also, we have a lot of empathy for this project. Also a project before Cartier. Everything was still done by descriptive geometry. When Gehry talks about this spiral stair, he's still bothered by this little bump that geometrically he could have solved very easily after Bilbao. So there's this kind of awkwardness that is very endearing for us in this building. It was his first European project, so there's a lot riding onto it, and how this new synthesis or this new paradigm shift in his work begins to inform, I think, what comes in the next 20 years. And then, of course, the intersection or the interlocking of the volumes, how one erases the other, creates this really spectacular skylights, whether it's this cruciform that's standing in the middle of the room, or these type of corner erasures or erosions that brings light into the space. Like, this is incredible for us. And then there was one moment where this is late 90s, early 2000s, where there were studies of adding on to or connecting the museum to the factory itself, which also had these type of circulation tentacles. So what's the point of showing Gehry and then showing our work? Because everything will go downhill from here. But I think we always see ourselves as, we built upon history. We understand our work as a continuation of other people's work or other people's other architects that came before us. And also, I think for us as not being historians, you look at someone's work. There's a certain autobiographical portrait. We think of Philip Johnson's text on his glass house. Somehow, whether it's Ledoux, whether it's Malevich, he's trying to incorporate it into his own work. So if we look at our own work early on, there's certainly this kind of predilection for these kind of singular volumes. And in fact, a few years ago at the Common Grounds Venice Biennale, we were invited to take one of Frank Gehry's project and begin to distort it or improve upon, which we don't dare to, but distort it. So we picked the Davis House. The Davis House was this is Frank Gehry's model, this kind of singular volume with a tilting plane, And we basically took the same building, but took 3 planes and introduced just a very slight curve, a concave, a convex, and then a concave curve again to the roof, taking the basic geometry of it. I mean, I think we're looking at, Gehry's use of perspective or false perspective and try to introduce this kind of fisheye perspective to it, just a very, very slight curvature, and then see what would happen. So all the apertures, everything stayed exactly where the Ron Davis house was. We spoke with Greg Wash, who designed the house with Frank Gehry at that time, his partner, and how the stair itself becomes something very different also. They're coming from the volume as opposed to an independent unit that's bridging over the house. But I would say, I think over the years, especially early on, I think this notion of this singular volumes that are maybe between being static and being dynamic is always present in our work. These are some of the single-family houses, or the exaggeration of a skylight becoming part of the volume. And then later on, when we have the project scale becomes larger, we don't find the single volume being sufficient anymore. We begin to think of ways of stacking these volumes, multiplying these volumes, hinging, rotating them, stacking them. This is for a pavilion in Shanghai, an early scheme, or a project in Rome where we begin to hinge 5 of these spaces, but utilize one type of roof to cut through it, and so that all the rooms have different heights, or stacking 9 of them together to form a new whole.
So what we wanted to do tonight was to put together a kind of edited collection of a couple of projects to kind of follow up and perhaps kind of reflect on some of these interests that Mark talked about that have come out of our sort of long-term study of Frank's work. And just maybe we're in the middle, but just a few words of introduction. I think Richard talked about our interest in the arts, and these early projects, most of them single-family houses, which is often how many architects in Los Angeles get their start, all somehow relate to or are developed in collaboration with artists or for collectors or in arts communities like Marfa. And each case brought together in different ways kind of alternative creative practices into our work that were, whether they were engineers or artists or writers. I think there's always a way in which we tend to expand the conversation around our work as a way to both allow us to operate very much at the core of the kind of disciplinary questions that interest us, but allow for a kind of expanded conversation around the kind of culture of each project. And so I think that we've had the chance to work on relatively small projects, but in far-reaching regions around the world, and I think that's given us a kind of depth of kinds of questions that we ask ourselves about the kind of larger ecology of our work, not only the obvious things about site and context, but sort of larger cultural practices that maybe inform the nuances of how buildings are built in different places and so forth. So we put together a couple of kind of groupings of projects, and this first one is perhaps kind of, if we talked about our initial smaller scale projects being singular objects, these works begin to look at when the object starts to multiply and begins to perhaps engage almost a kind of proto-urbanism. And in this case, this was our contribution to the Ordos 100 project. It was developed in 2008, 2009 under a master plan that was conceived of by Ai Weiwei and Herzog and de Meuron. And so we knew we were going to be surrounded by 99 other architects with a lot of ambition, perhaps designing their first house. And so we tried to think about, first, in the planning of the kind of siting of the building, the master plan was developed by Weiwei. By simply rotating the building on the site, we began to kind of introduce a sort of new oblique into this pretty restrictive planning layout that allowed us to perhaps occupy a larger scale of space within the development. And then thinking about what does it mean to develop a single-family house relatively large by Chinese standards at 10,000 square feet, how could we think about one singular object beginning to have a kind of urban quality about it? And so in this case, the act of doubling helped us begin to address this sort of beginning to multiply. And the double house, this project is called House House, always somehow maintains this doubleness of the reading, but from every perspective that the reading is different. And that was something that was also amplified by the siting of the building. And then Weiwei's only parameters for us were that it was a concrete structure and that it would be clad in brick. And so we began to sort of break down the massing of the building, first by the kind of doubleness, and then beginning to look at ways we could start addressing kind of offsetting and challenging expected ideas about how structure would flow through the load path of the wall by, for example, locating the building right at the corner, or creating a much more rich landscape of depth through the apertures that created this sort of interstitial space between the outside of the building and the inside, which is something that I think you'll see a lot in our work. And then finally, given this really large footprint, we introduce a really large void in the middle of the house, which is for circulation, but also for light and flow of air through that depth. So instead of having this massive footprint, we introduce that void that allows for the kind of landscape of air and light to move through the house and be part of this landscape of sort of in between inside and outside, light and dark. The site for the house is in Ordos, which is in westernmost edge of China, so it's very extremes of hot and cold. And so that inside the house, instead of thinking of this as kind of one singular building, we almost think of it like a proto-city with a number of smaller scale buildings all sort of subsumed within this doubleness of the profile. And more recently, we just finished this project. It's an art gallery on a really historic estate in Los Angeles on the site of an important Paul Williams house, which is he was an important residential architect, did part of the LAX restaurant Spider, so he had a very eclectic career in Los Angeles. But here it was a building for a number of different galleries with different kind of environmental requirements, and it also had a pretty significant section to navigate. And so this doubleness came into play as a way to absorb this number of different conditions from outside the building with the site, as well as the kind of conditions of the gallery within. So it's clad in a zinc, and the importance of this material was that we could use it on all surfaces of the building because of the section of the site, the roof also becomes an important elevation for the building. And then I think this idea of recessing the entry to the building is part of this, I think, ongoing interest of ours in navigating the interior and the exterior. So that depth that you see from the entry produces a kind of poché space that provides service and absorbs a lot of the maybe invisible parts of the building into those layers, those sort of buffer zones around the perimeter. So this is the smaller, more works on paper gallery, the upper gallery. And then that same kind of configuration is inverted, but the skylight condition is the same in the lower painting gallery. So the idea of how we can multiply and the same kind of structural figure, but produce a kind of different atmosphere and scale is something that is interesting to us. And then looking at how, here's I think a good example of how that doubleness sort of sits within the structure. And there's a stair that runs along the central spine that takes you from the upper to the lower gallery. This next project, I mean, perhaps in a way connected to the Ordos project, is, I think, become a kind of part of our kind of expanded practice, which is these kind of collective group projects. And we were invited by the architects Peza van Oerlikhausen, based in Chile, in Concepcion, to be part of a series of 10 projects that were initiated in Chile after the earthquake in 2010 in the Biobío region. So our site was in Penco, Chile, in a pine forest overlooking this bay. And so the buildings were meant to first be designed for sort of emergency services initially after the earthquake, and then what was sort of radical about it is that they will eventually become cultural programs, so that maybe their galleries or our building will be, it hasn't been completed yet, but it will be a dance studio. So it both had a real programmatic need, but also a kind of, for us there was a kind of commemorative quality to this, to mark this important kind of violent act. And so the idea for the project is to create one small, it's about 3,000 square feet of interior space, which is this volume, and then double that as an open space to the sky, overlooking this view. So you enter through an open-air courtyard, which is oriented towards the sky, so the rest of the world sort of disappears, and then you enter into the building, which is then oriented back towards the sort of beautiful horizon and the sweeping bay of Penco. So the building is then those two courtyards, elliptical-shaped courtyards, meet at one point of tangency, which is here, and then they're just very simply inscribed by concrete walls all cast in place that create this kind of, in a way, quite anonymous and ambiguous bunker-like shape. And then the poche space becomes the place where services and circulation and so forth are placed. So there's one moment where this kind of diagonal, where you enter on the corner of the courtyard and you see that sort of moment of tangency in the entry, which is represented here in this image, where you're walking through the forest and have this one kind of synergy between the vertical space of the forest and the horizon. And then within that courtyard, we needed to displace a couple of those trees, and so thinking about how to embed those kind of texture and scale of the landscape into the material of the building, we proposing to make molds of those pine trees, and that's what forms the scallop shape of that courtyard. So that kind of roughness somehow is an imprint of that site. And then on the inside, in a way, almost the opposite, where in our interest in sort of wrapping that sweeping view of the bay into the building as deeply as we can, so you're sort of totally inscribed by it, working with a very sort of rudimentary, simply polishing the concrete to get this sort of dull reflection that would carry that horizontal image of the horizon throughout, surrounding you in the inside. And not long after that, we were invited to another kind of collective project for the Shanghai West Bund Biennial. This building was finished in 2013. So again, a collection of pavilions that were marking a transformation in this part of Shanghai, just south of the city center along the Bund. So the building really didn't have a very clear program when we were given the brief. We needed to be able to accommodate events around the opening, and then imagine that it could be a kind of collective 7,000 square foot building, or it could be almost programmed and occupied in a modular way. And so it both has a feeling of being a singular object, but also having a sort of sense of loose agglomeration of a number of pieces. So it's the pavilion of 6 views, and so 3 of the pavilions are oriented outwards towards the city. There was a lot of interest in kind of video work and ways that we could engage the surrounding city through the orientation of the building, and then 3 interiorly oriented volumes which are organized around a central courtyard for light and air. So the building kind of approximates, in a way, the sort of relics of this industrial landscape, and then kind of has maybe a more slightly refined quality on the interior, so that each gallery has this sort of panoramic view to the surrounding city and the plaza, and then a secondary source of light at the sort of apex, the tightest point of each of the pavilions. And then alternatively, within the inside of the innermost galleries, that the courtyard is more present. And then most recently, the building has sort of changed uses many times, and then a year ago it was adopted by the Shanghai Center for Photography, and so they're using it as a kind of total space, but what is possible in terms of the planning is that it can really be one continuous gallery, or this can be one gallery and these can be alternative, programmed differently. So the kind of flexibility that was inherent in that modular kind of planning has borne out well for the kind of eventual programming of the building. And so then just 2 final projects. This is the Vault House, which in a way perhaps culminated some of the research of those past 2 projects. It's a single-family house on the beach in Southern California between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. And I think, of course, the beach the beach house is a sort of typology that is interesting probably to every LA architect, but it is incredibly challenging because you're faced with site conditions like this, which are, in this case, 140 feet long and 35 feet wide. So that the sort of hierarchy of space always is dominated by this part of the building, where by the time you get to the back, you really could be anywhere. So our first move was to introduce a void, a courtyard, into the length of the building, to sort of bring equivalency along the length of the entire volume of the house. there were really restrictive kind of zoning parameters for the building. So we just took a very direct approach to that, which was to simply build the maximum buildable envelope as a volume. And then the idea for us, this was for a family of 4, the children were out of the house, was to think about a single unit of a room, an integer of a room that could all be aligned in the same direction so that we would create a kind of depth and continuity throughout the extent of the house. And so in this case, that room became a vault, a vaulted room. So it was not simply a vault in a kind of structural way, but it was extruded to become volumetric. And then we packed all of those rooms in a unidirectional organization so that when you, as you cut a series of sections through them, visibility by eliminating corridors and those kind of traditional things that create kind of division and perhaps more hierarchy in a residential building. It's simply by modulating the scale of each vault, we're able to create a sort of fluid depth from the beach side, which is here where the house is raised off the sand to, in response to tsunami regulations, stepping back, the courtyard, which is open air, and then finally in the back of the house, the building sits right on the sand where the garage is. And I think that this plan allowed us not only to have this kind of visibility, almost kaleidoscopic-like transparency through the building, but it also, in this diagram, gave us a lot of sort of poché space that allowed us to both have a much more simple idea towards structure. So instead of expensive moment frames, we could work within these poché zones to develop the structure for the building, and also all of the services flow in that poché space. So a couple of models that just give you a sense of how, as we were developing the building, how that transparency was evident in the front elevation. We work in models of very different scales. When all of these pieces of the model together, it's about a 15-foot long building. And just a few words to say that once we developed this logic of the vault, we really tried to let the intersections happen as they did, and it wasn't, and so in some cases we had these sort of nice occluded relationships, and others perhaps something more awkward, almost creating a Gothic vault. And our intention was to really let those intersections happen and then begin to negotiate programmatically and through light and so forth. So I think from the beach, the building feels quite transparent, and then alternatively, on the street side, it is perhaps in a way more responsive to its neighborhood, and even by using that same strategy, carving out a void to allow for a more generous entry for guests that are coming through that enter immediately into the courtyard. So these are, and the house was finished in 2013. I think in this image you just get a glimpse of some of the sort of pseudo Spanish-style houses. There's a very eclectic kind of landscape that somehow we wanted to acknowledge that, both in the immediate context, but also thinking historically about that tradition in Southern California. So zooming in now, this is the south elevation, the passage into the courtyard. The courtyard became a really important place. It's relatively well tempered, but it gets really windy here, and so the courtyard becomes a kind of still center that, of course, has light and affords view and access to both sides of the house. So it really does become the center. So here we're looking towards towards the street, and then this is the view to the ocean. And I think one of the important arguments that we won with our client was, instead of the traditionally having master bedroom and all the sort of most primary programs right up against the beach facade, we were able to set that back and create a double height living space that allowed these views to be visible all the way through the house. And then looking back, kind of exact position, but looking the other way, relocating the private rooms of bedrooms affording that view into the living room, but also allowing that room to be adjacent to the courtyard. So that sort of landscape of light and view is
By the way, the two fish sculptures on the right-hand, if you go back one, the two fish sculptures were relics from Frank Gehry's Rebecca's restaurant that was torn down. And they finally made it to the beach.
So I think the idea, too, of the vault becomes something that both performs acoustically and also really, for us, we benefited a lot through the way light played and the way that the clerestory windows work along the ceiling. Just taking you through a few more views from the master bedroom. Now back on the other side of the courtyard in the study, and some of the details of how the light works along the figures of the ceiling profiles. And then finally at the roof, where we're still looking for carving through that depth to create the deck, the jacuzzi, and so forth. And then the last project is the Menil Drawing Institute. It's a competition we won in 2012 that will finish and open in October of 2017. So this was the site that we were given. This is Renzo's building from 1987, the Twombly Pavilion from 97, Rothko Chapel, Byzantine Chapel. And so our building is a building for drawings. It's about 30,000 square feet, and so it, in a way, exists between the scale of a domestic house and a museum building. This is our proposal. It sits in about the geographic center of the building, nested up around these domestic houses that are part of the special landscape of the Menil, and then we create a new green, a new kind of space for art and garden in the campus. And the conceptual idea for the building is simply kind of introducing a very thin folded plate steel roof over the building and extending out over the landscape to embrace the existing trees and create this sort of modeled landscape, a sort of halo of shadow around the building given the sensitive environmental conditions of the interior. So just a few quick slides showing the evolution of the project. These were the existing trees, and this was the given footprint. We started by creating 3 rooms around these existing trees, so kind of a hortus conclusus as an entry point to the building. And then the building fills in the space around those courtyards. Within the interior, it's kind of made up of a series of small-scale rooms for exhibition, administration, the study, and conservation of drawings. And then it's all unified by this roof that extends out over the landscape. And then structurally, it became a kind of, I won't get into too much detail, but developing a system of very thin spanning roofs and then combined with kind of thick roofs that allowed for the kind of environmental systems and modulation of light that we needed on the interior. Of course, light was a key part of developing this building so that we could minimize the reliance on mechanical systems and shading and such. So this stretching out over the landscape, this was one of the early studies of light, allowed us by kind of extending the footprint, move from 10,000-foot candles, which is the standard sort of Texas summer day, to 5-foot candles in the gallery in this space, with almost no, just simply by the way that we shaped the architecture and integrated the building and the landscape. So from the south, the building feels kind of mute and simply almost a porch to this new park where the landscape architect is Michael van Valkenburg. And then as you move to the west side of the building, it reveals itself at a very different scale, almost at the scale of the surrounding domestic houses around it. All the entries to the building are through a courtyard, and so that is the kind of the first moment where the light levels are dropped, and you get this first glimpse of the diagonal, which is the sort of organizing principle for the building. You just saw the west courtyard. This is the east courtyard, a slightly more domestic kind of planting landscape, and again, that diagonal view into the third scholar courtyard. You enter into the living room, which is the kind of midpoint of the building between north and south. It is both a meeting space for an entry for the building, but also a kind of collective space for the entire campus. I think these sections just give you that sense of how that thickness and thinness of the envelope works in response to program and the relationship between the building and the landscape. So here's the scholar courtyard, living room, and gallery. Alternatively, the drawing room, the really center of the building, the one place where drawings and natural light can come together. That thick roof of the back building is designed to modulate light through different skylight wells and simple filter systems. And then finally, the scholar courtyard, an intimate space that's more for working and contemplation, that's on the north side of the building with a different scale of landscape. And so I think the idea for the Drawing Institute, in a way, brings together a lot of the interests we talked about these thresholds between interior and exterior, dark and light, the modulation of building and landscape that I think culminate in a way, in a very direct way in this project, but hopefully you've seen in a number of the projects that we shared. So that's the end of our presentation.
I think there are tough acts to follow, and then there's really tough ones to follow. And as much as I admired their work when we were students together, understand I was an old student, so that you can pick that up from looking at us. But of all the ones that I knew in that time period, I just wish I could be you. The work is absolutely stunning. I really never thought all that much about form, performance, determinism. I do often, and I had often spoken to students about the fact that if you really understood how things worked, there was no formal determinism. That you depended upon formal determinism when you didn't understand how things work. It was sort of an easy thing to fall back on. But about a year or two ago, that was sort of the only way that I talked about it. But about a year or two ago, Peter Eisenman asked me if I would be his partner in a competition, the same competition that I think the entire planet of architects worked on for the Guggenheim Helsinki. And I went into his office, and he sort of walked me through what he thought the plan was going to be. He walked me through what the form was going to be. And I could see him steeling himself because he was waiting for the moment that I would tell him how things would have to change. Indeed, he was expecting me to say that, well, if we really were going to be responsive to sun, if we're going to be responsive to heat, if we're going to be responsive to these things, this is going to have to change within that. He was waiting for it. He was daring me to challenge that. I said, Peter, whatever you put there, we can find a way to strategically intervene on it such that the form is untouched. We can make this about as sustainable as anything you've ever done in your entire life. Well, that's actually easy to do when it comes to Peter. Something sustainable for the entire life. So but there's no sort of relationship whatsoever with form if you really understand working with these phenomena. So I was really intrigued when Richard asked if I would participate in this conversation, and not just because of the opportunity to be on the stage with people that I really do admire their work so very much, but also to flesh out some more ideas about what I think this relationship between form and performance are. Mark and Sharon and I did chat a little bit about a week ago on this, and we all agreed that this was a false dichotomy, trying to set up form and performance, looks and performance as something that were combative, that were a polarizing opposite. And what I want to suggest to you today, that comes from sort of a particular belief about technology that has been transported to sort of many other types of areas. And so hopefully I can sort of pull this apart and we can see a different way of thinking about what these relationships are. When I think about something like a structural system, or in this case sort of a structural diagram, how neatly it becomes a structural system, how clear it is when it becomes a building. We can look at something when we deal with structure, we can see its relationship to form, we can see the lineage from diagram, from theory, all the way to the sort of final manifestation, in any possible type of way. It's clear. The lineage is clear, the relationships are clear. You can enter into that argument at any point. You can deduce a structural system, from looking at what the diagram might be. You can sort of go the other direction with it. It's a nice, neat lineage. We get that. We get that sort of great relationship and clear relationship between form and the performance of the system. This is something that's absolutely almost sort of the essence of how we think very much about architecture. Form can inform the structural system, it can be informed by it, it can be hidden, it can be expressed, but it is integral to it. So when we move into the world of energy, we want this same clarity of a relationship. We want that same clarity between form and the performance of a system. But we're moving into a very, very different kind of territory when we do that. So if we think about the equations for how heat moves, and these are the equations for how heat moves, these are the most difficult equations of classical physics. not practically solved until the 1970s. So we go from structural systems, which have perhaps the most basic and fundamental equations of physics, to heat transfer, which has the most difficult equations of physics. And then on top of it, we go to the technologies that we use within buildings, which on the whole are sort of a Rube Goldberg collection of different types of systems that we have within a building. And we hope that somehow there will be that same kind of neat relationship between the science, the theory, the technology, and the building. We yearn for that to be so in the same way that we deal with it in terms of a structural system. I mean, just to give you an example, this is from a building at Yale. Every 15 minutes, 57 pages of information about just the air handlers is dumped by that system. So we really want there to be something neat between the sort of incredible complexity of the technologies that we use, the performance of the technologies that we use, sort of a nice convergence between that with form and with the theory. And there simply is not. We keep trying to sort of shoehorn one in. We keep trying to jerry-rig something in. We are inundated with every kind of tool out there sort of trying to help us figure out what that relationship might be. Tons of design advisors. And so we end up with something very much like this. This comes from the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy sort of, instead of helping us understand what that theoretical lineage might be, instead looks at example buildings or model buildings and sort of tries to communicate to us what that relationship should be between form and performance through a selection of these sort of ideal model or exemplar types of buildings. They're collected into their high performance buildings database. And just take a look at this statement. So the lack of empirical data demonstrating the relationship between building characteristics and energy performance is one of the primary barriers in the energy efficiency market. I mean, try to imagine if you were thinking about structural systems that the only way that you would know to design a structural system for a building would be to go and look at a collection of sample buildings and you would pluck one from that and assume that might be a relevant way of thinking about how you would design a structural system. That's basically the intention behind a system like this. And just to show you sort of how far they want to take it or how far they've hoped to be able to take it, in their first compilation of this particular high-performance building database, they wanted to develop the sort of ultimate building design advisor, the kind of design advisor that if you really were making an energy-efficient building, it would tell you what is the orientation going to be, what is the shape going to be, what is the form going to be, what are the materials going to be. And this is a sample that they presented when they first developed that design advisor. And I'm just going to walk you through a couple of key points to it. So in this type of thing, either you have your energy measure on or you have it off. If you have it off, you apparently don't care about energy. If you have it on, you care about energy and you're going to let it guide you to exactly the energy perfect building. So there's a couple of things to notice on this. The first thing is under the opaque envelope, the wall, an extremely insulated envelope. And then the next thing you come down to, number of floors. So what it's encouraging you to do is sort of like lower the number of floors, taking yourself down to a one-floor building. If you go through this particular design advisor, what it's trying to reconcile and what it's trying to develop in terms of sort of the ideal form is that first of all, it's all about conduction. So it decides the envelope has to be as opaque, it has to be as thick, it has to be as sealed, it has to be as insulated as it possibly can, taken to the extreme. It's also because it's only thinking about conduction, it wants a really deep floor plate. So very deep floor plate, minimizing the surface area to the volume or the interior of the ratio. But next, the other sort of energy feature it wants you to deal with is daylighting. But it doesn't want to have daylighting coming through the side because it's a deep floor plate, plus that glazing is very problematic. So the ideal daylighting is all going to come from solitudes in the roof. So the only thing that really works to be the perfect building in terms of energy efficiency is a giant big box store. That is sort of what it wants to take you for. And so this is where that kind of combination of trying to sort of pull out what they consider to be energy efficient strategies without actually ever tying them back to the original physics of how things work, has led us sort of in this desire to have a very clear deterministic relationship between form and performance. So I'm going to suggest for you two different types of sort of things we should be comparing. Instead of form and performance, behavior and performance. And by behavior, I'm not talking about how people behave, but I'm actually talking about how things behave, how air behaves, how light behaves. Think about that as behavior as opposed to performance when I start thinking about the technological systems for this. So I'm actually also going to, knowing, of course, that I would assume that their last project was going to be the Menil Drawing Studio, I'd actually start with the very first project that got me thinking very much in this terms of what the relationship between form and performance was many, many years ago when I was still a doctoral student on this. Pretty much everybody in here of a certain age has seen this drawing, this sort of famous drawing of the Louvres. For many years, students were taught this, they studied this in technology, they studied this in lighting design. There's a sort of idea of how light is distributed in this space. I looked at this and I thought, this looks like a really bad idea. Surely in Houston, Texas, this is the last thing you'd want to do in this building. And so I got a small grant to go down there, and what I do often, and anytime I visit a building, I make sure I'm either on the roof or in the basement. I try to get into both places. So I went up on the roof. And what I noticed up on the roof, and this is just a few of my images, I apologize for the quality of the images, these were slides, and when I was thinking about doing this after our conversation, I did find them in some moldy box in my basement. And I quickly found someone to digitize them for me, so they're a little bit, clouded up from all the mold that was on the slide. So a slight performance problem in my basement. But this was very much what the roof was like, that quite a bit of it was covered over. And actually, this is a part of it that wasn't nearly as covered over as much of the part to the left. And if you went inside, you could match the parts that were covered over. So anywhere that was around the lobby, anywhere that dealt with a corridor or sculpture had the system as it was. Painting, any place that dealt with painting had it covered over. And then, of course, in any place that had a traveling exhibit or had works on paper, it was double covered within that. And, just to think that to realize that it's not sort of a question of just noticing that, I realized later on that it was evident from the monograph. This comes from the monograph. It's quite evident in there that part of it is covered over, but yet that was never the kind of communication that was communicated, never the type of information that was communicated to many of us on this. And of course, if you think about light, and we think about light very much as being something that is about as formally deterministic as you can imagine, you think about designing for daylight, think about aperture size, you think about the glazing characteristic of that. That seems incredibly deterministic to us. Yet light is a micron scale behavior, which means if you understand how light works, you can pluck it from anywhere and you can move it anywhere. This sort of direct relationship between the building form and light does not exist. We can make it exist as we do when we have it on the left, which side? The left. We can make it exist in that type of fashion in the clumsiest of all possible ways. We spend so little time actually sort of like dealing with how it really does behave, which would be more on the right. So this takes us to sort of the other part of how to think about how things relate. So rather than relating form to performance, what is sort of the relationship between form and phenomena on this? And it takes me back to that structural system. If we look at something similar in terms of, this is a sort of a structural diagram, we'd go and we'd look at a thermodynamic diagram, and so we'd see sort of schematically what that might be like. Well, we have a tendency within the field of architecture to take that and map that onto the building in the same way that we map that structural diagram right onto the building as well. We'd map it like this. We'd map it as sort of the envelope as being the boundary of that system. Some strange things happened with the color when we transferred the slides over there. So it is not sort of an apocalyptic sun coming in there that's or some very strange Martian death ray coming into the building that is supposedly sun. But anyway, we want to map it onto envelope in the same way we map a structural system onto the envelope or onto the form of a building, in and, something coming in, something leaving that. We see that manifest in sort of images like this, the sort of great, I love this image. I managed to, in the decades that I have been lecturing, it will show up no matter what I'm lecturing about. I love this image. But it is a really bizarre one when you think about the fact that everything gets sort of mitigated, controlled through the building envelope. No matter what it is, supposedly the envelope is the thing that matters. And again, it's that sort of direct mapping of thermodynamic behavior on that. It's what leads us to doing things that are incredibly perverse, sort of something like this, which I've sort of thought that we would take this incredibly toxic sort of, it's a very toxic process for making this particular material. It doesn't perform at all in the way that one thinks it does, but that belief that we have to wrap buildings in this to things like this, which is also sort of assuming that the envelope means everything. We continue to carry it on to thinking, well, we can solve our energy problem just by shrinking the envelope down even further from that standpoint. But if we come and we look at an actual thermodynamic system, what would that actually look like? Well, it wouldn't look like a building envelope. If I could show you or sort of demonstrate for you what sort of the perfect sort of behavior would be that demonstrates this thermodynamic system, this is the cleanest example I can find. It's a lightning strike. That's exactly how a thermodynamic system behaves. And the most important thing about it is that it's transient. It disappears, it dissipates. The minute that energy is exchanged, it's gone. So this thought of fixing it to an envelope is really quite a bizarre thing on this. And so this sort of idea that it belongs to the things that we make, when it's the last thing that it belongs to would be the thing that we make. So coming back to these equations, if this is sort of just what describes for us what the actual behavior is of air, then we can come to something like this, which deals with how the body actually responds to that, what matters in that. And if you start to look at this and you walk your way through how the body actually feels in a space, the least important thing, air temperature. The thing we spend a great deal of time controlling, the thing we spend a great deal of time sort of designing these massive systems for, almost insignificant when it comes to how the body actually feels. And so we're really caught with what we'd want to do in terms of the science of this, understanding the science of this, to dealing with the phenomena of that. How do we get to that point? So if I were to put up sort of range that we would go through, we're thinking about the actual physical phenomena that we deal with, how we might begin to sort of manipulate those behaviors, the fact that those behaviors, how we might be moving, heat, light, sound, how it interacts with the body, and then ultimately what we care about in terms of perception. Where does form fit into this? Our intervention fits here in the middle. How we intervene on that in order to sort of cause what it is to sort of create the way the body feels by manipulating the behavior fits in there. That's not form. It might be carried on form. Form might be an armature for it, but it's not form. It is the type of material intervention that we do in order to manipulate that. So I'm going to end with a project that I think sort of explains this sort of, not just this relationship or non-relationship between form and phenomena or form and performance, but kind of lays out an alternative way for thinking about it. Some of you might be familiar with the Rothko murals at Harvard University. These were murals that had been really badly displayed for many years in a penthouse with too much light on them. It was used for parties. People had spilled drinks on them. They'd really been badly managed. And so what you see on the right is what they had become. They'd completely faded. What you see on the left is a restored version of that. For the restorers of this was a particularly difficult project for them to do. The part of it that was so difficult is that normally if you're going to be restoring pigment that's faded, you do so with an addition of pigment. That's the standard approach to something like this. But for a Rothko, that was going to be really problematic. And for these in particular, very problematic. Because very much of what he did was sort of developing his own types of pigments, and such that the canvas became as much a part of the texture of this, artifact or this painting as the pigments that were on it. And so applying new pigments to recreate the color would have destroyed the texture of the canvas and the use of the canvas. And so they were left with really quite a dilemma of what would be authentic. Was authentic to recreate the color? Was authentic to preserve the artifact or the canvas of it? What did you want to do? And so Jens Stenger, who was the curator for this, realized that he could do both. He could leave the canvas as it was and yet deal with what was visually the phenomenon of the original artwork. It's all done through digital projection. So he's showing here what that projection looks like, sort of stepping back right here, showing how they've done this pixel by pixel on the Rothkos. So for an hour a day, you can come in and see what it would have looked like, and you cannot tell the difference. You can, unless you interrupt the projection, you cannot tell that that is a projection on that surface. Because as far as the eye is concerned, what's coming to the eye is that range of color, is that color as if it were coming from that pigment. So the canvas is as it was, but the phenomenon that comes to you is as it was intended to be. You're getting both within this, so not sort of privileging one or the other, but sort of understanding that the phenomena doesn't have to be driven by the form. The form actually can be autonomous to this. And I think if there's something that I could leave you with is sort of this understanding that if we really do know how to work these phenomena, if we really do understand what the point of working with these phenomena are, whether it is to sort of deal with how we might heat or cool the body, how we might see something in space, it truly is something that we manipulate discreetly, that we manipulate transiently, but we manipulate in relationship to understanding how it interacts with the body. Almost every discussion we have about building performance, the body's excluded from that. As a matter of fact, often if we look at HVAC system performance, and we talk about HVAC system performance, the human occupants of a space will be considered to be unwelcome perturbations that are disrupting the optimal performance of that particular system. But what we have in a case like this is this sort of understanding of this duality or simultaneity as opposed to a determinism on this. So that's where I'd like to stop. And I don't know how we go from this other than talk about the Menil collection.
Thank you for those fantastic presentations, lectures. And now, I suppose I have the duty of sort of thinking about exactly how to, there are a lot of different themes that are brought up, and And I think that they cover diverse territory. The thing that I had actually thought to begin the discussion with was what your thoughts were about why the binary, the dichotomy between looks and performance even existed, what was at stake in it. And I think in some respects the discussion of Aldo van Eyck is interesting in that regard, because there's some question about what was it that his aversion to a certain body of work came from, particularly in the sort of postmodern period, I guess broadly defined, but let's say 70s and 80s. And what was it that made Gehry acceptable? I don't know if you have thoughts about why, what is it that animates so much often vitriolic discussion or animated discussion around this particular question of looks versus performance? Can I start with a general query?
Well, I guess if I go back to Peter, for many years, no matter what Peter Eisenman would lecture on, he'd end the lecture, could be about Palladio, but he'd end the lecture by saying that sustainable design was ruining architecture. And it was very much, his belief about the fact that there was a formal determinism that was eroding the autonomy of architecture within that. And I can't say that I know where that came from. I speculate, and I'd be interested to hear whether other people have that same observation or speculation. But it seems to me that very much of it was a vestige of the passive solar movement that came about in the 60s and 70s that was entirely about form. And that left such a bad taste in many individuals' mouths about the fact that if it was going to be responsive to the sun, then it was driving these particular types of responses. There are very particular material responses and very particular formal responses that seemed incredibly restrictive to architecture. But that's just a general, observation, and I'm not sure if that's one that's actually generalizable from my own personal observation.
But you also, I think it's right mentioning Peter, because in my mind, at least, his text on post-functional, already he set up this dichotomy between really functional versus the look of functional. The look of functional becoming like a designing agent.
Yeah, I feel like it has something to do. I have a view of what it might come from, which is also, that we still are children of a certain kind of modernist ethics. And modernist ethics are largely iconoclastic in their values. So the Van Eyck, is interested in something that he might think of as habitat, and this is a good. And anything which, and then for instance, you were showing, Mark, the houses by Gehry, and I was thinking about how, whether it's the Davis barn or the Wagner house, in which they play with perspective perception, that this idea of playing with perception is a kind of discursive and symbolic activity. How does that touch on the more fundamental questions of habitat and human well-being? And that for someone so in a way, if you hadn't told me that Van Eyck liked Gehry, I would have thought, oh, he can't like Gehry because he actually is dealing with these fripperies of symbolic practice. But then I think that as you were going through the work and you described the difference between the play of the section, overhead in the kitchen, versus the quotidian environment of the below, the sort of habitat that Gehry is an eminently practical architect who delivers both discursive pleasures and habitat comforts in a way. But I think that somehow it is there's something about the way in which people have thought of these things as divided worlds.
Well, I think Van Eyck is for us an important figure. You know, he's never an extremist. He talked about twin phenomena. You know, it's always inclusive of both extremities. You know, I think also it's a generation that came after Athens Charter, and they had to deal with post-war European construction. So they're much more integrative and reformist in terms of their sense about habitat, in terms of history. I mean, that's why we thought that generation of modernists it's interesting to us, because they're telling us what we can do versus what we cannot do. You know.
Right.
I mean, in more ways than one, our Manil Drawing Institute, I mean, we looked a lot at Valdo Van Eyck's Wheels of Heaven Church. You know, 2 courtyards, and how the courtyards are part of the park as well as part of the building. You know, these kind of in-between phenomena we look at a lot.
It's funny because in the development of your, it was very interesting that you framed your work in relationship to Gehry, because Gehry, you know, if you think about Gehry's work, it does tend to divide. I mean, you can always describe his buildings in terms of relatively straightforward typologies, you know, dumbbell plans, you know, where the fire stairs are, the sequences are straightforward, and then there is elaboration. Often, I mean, it's spatial ornament in a way. But in your work, you know, in like the examples of the twin houses, those things which are figural, recognizably iconographic, are nevertheless also like they are the habitat. They don't hover over, they are it, and yet they are nevertheless. I mean, they're sort of both again, and in a way, perhaps in a manner that I could imagine being more palatable to Van Eyck, that habitat and iconography converge. But I think, again, I do think it's that somehow habitat is the good, performance is the good. It's the politically binding discourse around which people can agree because it sustains us in comfort or well-being, and the rest seems like excess. But I mean, in some ways, it seems. I mean, I'm not sure how Michelle's if in the. I mean, there's kind of. I was trying to like sort of figure out how to think about this problem of phenomena as you described it versus form, and how that also overcomes these traditional and perhaps unnecessary divisions. I mean, you know that there's this famous description in Learning from Las Vegas in which Venturi mockingly describes how he thought that Rudolph would describe a window. And now I've already given away the punchline, but he I have to paraphrase now, but he called in Rudolph's mind a window, or perhaps in some generalized idea of the modernist architect, a window is a vitreous membrane that transmits light. And then Venturi says, and I would call it a window. and the window, but the window is a prohibited term because it is a convention and an iconic one, and so it sort of points to this kind of strange division in the civil wars of architectural culture.
I could share with you. I think the window is an important thing that we look at since the beginning of our practice. We started our practice after spending a few years in Switzerland. And where construction cost is like 5 times that of Los Angeles when we started. And I remember when I was in Switzerland, architects would show the images of their buildings, then they would zoom in, and that you would see that when the bolts and the screws are completely tightened, they're in the same angle. It's built like a Cartier watch, and when we're back in Los Angeles, we'd laugh and plaster, so we had 2 very different realities. I remember Sharon and I were flipping through a G8 document, and we could tell which building that was shown without looking at the captions, which was a European building, which is an American building, based on how thick the window frames are. And I think at that outset we decided we don't want to be trapped by the Pella window system, So what do we do? So we decided, well, why don't we push the window back, set it back, and then give the frame back to the architecture. So you can't look at the building and say, this is a 1970s building, this is a 1998 building. And certainly, so that impetus for us is a formal impetus, you could say. You know, it's an aesthetic decision. You know? But I think for us, setting back the window also has a series of effects. Setting back the window, creating this poche, for us also creates shade for the window. You know, as opposed to something that is applied on, it's something that's recessed. So it's has more. The aperture has more to do with the gestalt of the volume. You know, so I'm describing an example where how we literally think about the issue like a window.
You know? I mean, somehow like Cannes, you make some of your buildings feel. They don't feel exactly empty or void of glass. I mean, it's quite apparent, but like, I mean, Cannes hid the glass in shadow, made it frameless such that the building could feel as if in some way the pure habitat of the ruins in his case was simply jury-rigged in order to make it habitable. And it makes the building feel more like a direct habitat, but
I mean, there's a very pragmatic part of that. I mean, Michelle talked about this opacity of the wall. And we also dealt with a lot of opacity in the outset of our practices because the projects the budgets are very challenging. You know, so we know that we can't do a lot, and we know that we have to be smart in how to distribute the design energy as well as where we focus on spending more construction costs on. And I think this is something that we learned a lot from Gehry or architects like Caesar. You know, you can have a very blank wall for 90%, but when you do make a move, make something that affects that whole blank wall. You know, I think this is something how this design economy is achieved that we learn a lot from looking at Gehry.
And I mean, I wonder if another example along those lines, going back to Michelle's bad example, was at the Manil. I mean, I think, you know, it was perhaps not as cheap of a building as the initial projects Mark's referencing, but it was a building that we knew we weren't going to be able to rely on a lot of technology to make it work. We had very restrictive environmental requirements on you know, most so on lighting. And so I think part of the idea of borrowing from others, like our landscape architects, like using the garden as a way to make a prelude to the architecture, instead of making the envelope have to do all these things that it would be expensive and complicated to do. We sort of work in a very dumb way, but grab more material from maybe outside of our discipline to make our building kind of maybe smarter but dumber at the same time by using the landscape in that case, let's say, to shade our windows, to create, to do things about phenomena so your eyes are behaving differently when you're inside. So, anyway, I think that's...
I think it was just you, because I couldn't even hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but thinking about the window and sort of taking this on a little bit of a tangent, because it does demonstrate very much this idea about the artifact versus the behavior of the artifact. I just gave an assignment yesterday in my seminar. I have an advanced materials seminar, and it relates to, it's actually called The Window, and it starts with the sort of seminal essay, the Rowe and Sutsky essay on transparency, literal and phenomenal, but as a inverse of that what they described as literal behavior, literal transparency, is sometimes something that's quite contingent, and what they describe as phenomenal transparency is something that I can actually write the equations for and describe. The key thing for a piece of glass is that a piece of glass might have a fixed performative value. Its fixed performative value of transparency, but whether or not it's transparent is entirely due to its context. So in its context, a transparent piece of glazing can also be a mirror. It can behave as if it's opaque. So its performance, its phenomenal behavior is entirely contingent, even though its performance would be something that would be marked as constituent, that would be marked as whatever the molecular composition is of it determines what its performance characteristics are, but its phenomenal characteristics are things that are driven by the moment and the circumstance, the context in which you view it. Where your eye is, where the light is, will determine that.
So, Michelle, I've seen many of your lectures now, and I feel as if, and this one is of a piece in which I think that you often are trying to, you want to undermine alibis that architects turn to, and reveal that the claims that they make, with which they want to underpin their works with objective standards of performance, are insufficient and really hold very little water, so to speak. But there are commitments in the things that you describe that have to do with the response of the body to phenomena, affective relationships, I assume, to often invisible. I mean, you deal often with invisible phenomena like heat or air movement. I mean, light isn't exactly invisible, but it actually is. It just makes other things visible. So I just wonder, I mean, it makes me think about an architect like Philippe Brahm, who tries to make a practice out of the manipulation of these invisible things. Do you think that there are? I mean, you went into Peter's office and you said, we can make anything work. And it puts me in mind of, we had a class, actually David Lieberman organized architects from Yale who came in, were talking to students years ago who were asked by some of the students, well, if you were to optimize a building, what would you make? And the engineers said, well, we wouldn't make anything. We only optimize according to what are essentially the external criteria that architects bring to us through their propositions of design, and then we optimize within set parameters within that. But I mean, what do we make of technical criteria, or even those of comfort? What advice you gave Peter no guidance?
But we had a lot of strategies worked out. We did on that. But no formal guidance.
Phenomena maybe are form. I mean, you are shaping experience by things that you call phenomena. We have someone on the faculty who is doing research on acoustical geometry to shape acoustical environments with form. But I wonder where architects end up in such.
Hello?
Well, I do like to hear what you think about Philippe Brahm as an example. Because, I'm just thinking of the question and the old adage that
All architects are formalists, but they have different ways of lying about them. So I'm taking it on face value, and think are some of these invisible phenomena form-giving, or could it be form-giving? Or in case of Philip, is it a stretch, or is it more like Rainer Banham? I think exposed power versus concealed power, where it's really the conduits, really the hardware that are exposed.
I'm in both camps, on this, and that, for me, the thing that has inspired me the most over the last couple of years was actually this Rothko restoration, because for me that is exactly the way that I'd want to see this interaction between artifact and phenomenon. That they exist simultaneously, and we understand them in their simultaneity, and not in that deterministic way. So that to me deals with it. I've gone in many different directions on this, and I say where I am now is I'm really interested in armature. The physical armature, the constituent armature. And then what is contingent, and that the phenomena themselves are contingent. They're the things that are momentary, and they're the things that are transient. And so what would be the interaction between what we would consider to be that constituent armature and then that contingent phenomena? And that's, for me, the way that the simultaneity between the form and the phenomena begin to exist. but not in that sort of neat linear way that we'd have with a structural system.
Maybe, I mean, it's interesting because in the case of the Rothko, it must be that, I mean, people are aware of how the effect is being created, no? I mean, when you're there, I'm asking.
You don't know it unless you walk in front of it.
So you figure it out. So part of the, I mean, there must be a new sort of curiosity in the experience, which is that you get to see the restored Rothko, and you get to know that it's being created through these kind of fascinating technical means, which strikes me as being, in a sense, like architecture at its best and most discursive, which is that that we are interested in creating these phenomena or habitats, environments to which we respond to often effectively without even understanding how and why. But part of what architects are often doing, you know, I suppose what we think of as sophisticated architecture, and maybe this is where the problem lies, creating this category, but it is, we think the sophisticated architecture draws our attention to the mechanisms and means by which phenomena are let's say, provoked or induced. And that's even, you know, going back to the Gehry, particularly those early projects, the ways in which the windows are aligned or not aligned with the perspectival, the apparent perspectival shaping of the objects, it interferes with our understanding of perspective and the natural geometry of the object versus perceptual ones. But that's the kind of thing which, once again, to my mind, falls, I don't know, I mean, it's an interesting question whether architecture's responsibilities are to bring attention to its construction in the broadest sense of the word, or simply to, like sometimes to my mind in that more Protestant ethic of modernism, to provide good habitat.
I don't know if
You know the TV show Batman, I think 70s? One of his nemesis was Batman. Yeah. Yes, exactly. You know Mr. Freeze? One of his nemesis, Mr. Freeze, no? So he lives in like this sub-zero environment. Yeah. No one can live except himself. So when Batman and Robin get in there's a way, there's a heat beam that projects into the space, and then there will be a normal temperature within that heat beam. But he can make it smaller and smaller and smaller, and then Batman will be freezing. So, but I'm just comparing that to the Rothko experience, which is...
To Philip Brahm.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to compare too.
Yeah. No, but Philip does claim if you're over here, you're cooler. Yeah. You're over here, you're warmer. You're happier over here and sad over here. You know, but it's such a. I'm thinking of the Rothko example, which is such a subtle environment. You know, it's a museum environment. I mean, we saw it was great. I mean, it was a museum environment. You're toned down. You're not like looking at this in everyday life. And then the subtlety of the light, and then you're immersed in that piece. I mean, there's a certain degree of isolation one needs to have, as opposed to something very explicit, as in the Batman Mr. Freeze situation, you know, where the beam of light is projected, whereas something like structure is much more conductive of something more blatant, as opposed to something that comes in a much more subtle way. You know?
I'm not sure whether which you're advocating, because in some ways, like the Rothko experience seems new. It's not the original, and part of what's interesting about it is that it's not, and so it's not like it's not a naturalized experience. I mean, in some respects, the question of looks versus performance is one in which it seems as if the suggestion is that we have to make a decision, when in fact maybe the goal is to enjoy the look of performance, which is what the Rothko provides. I mean, the technical apparatus that we see that transforms the Rothko architecture is the technical apparatus, the image of which we enjoy seeing, that provides the environment that makes phenomena, or our, I guess, effective habitation of it.
So I'm wondering, when you talk about it being a sort of subtler, more nuanced type of response, is part of how we might begin to separate these things is that there is no physiological or perceptual response to structure. You know, we might view it, we might have sort of collect information from it, but in terms of sort of having some type of physiological or perceptual response, there is not one. Whereas when we deal with energy, when we're dealing with heat and light and sound, we do have that bodily response. And I think that's a way of sort of seeing these things as existing, this, again, the form belonging to the structural part, but not belonging to the part that ultimately is about this perceptual response.
Which I think is also incredibly, it's the sense of temporality in the phenomena is totally different than in structure. And I feel like that sort of ephemerality of the phenomena is something else, that the sort of fixity of structure, resolving those two things is, I think, also part of maybe where the challenge, or, you know, like Philip Brahms' attempt to do that, it seems like it becomes fixed when in fact it's the ephemerality of the heat exchange, the warm to cold, that actually is its ephemerality is what makes it important, not to sort of fix it through architecture in the way that maybe his work sometimes attempts to do.
I still think that there's something about a kind of a prejudice now, which is part of a pendular swing that's gone too far, where the say optical experience is treated as if it's not, like it doesn't produce effective response, whereas I think of those 19th century German psychologists of aesthetic experience that imagined that the horizontal line created calm and the vertical something else, and that, I don't remember what the other thing was, but what? Anxiety. I thought so, but I wasn't sure. Yes, I didn't want to think about anxiety, but that you know, the formal arrangement of physical spaces has this effective. It creates affective response, which is physiological in nature, and I think that there's this. I mean, because today, to some extent, the sort of curiosity about affect is something that is more immediate and, in a sense, more real than discursive response, intellectual response. Also, it disfavors visuality. So I think that part of the opposition to looks is literally the opposition to visual coding of architecture. But
you would have hated the first assignment that I gave in this particular seminar in September, where they had to create a visual reading of an object that was completely decoupled from the object. So they had to build an object, but the visual reading of it had to be completely dislocated or decoupled or transformed from the object, so that there would be nothing similar about the perception of the object and the object itself. So creating a form doesn't necessarily sort of like fix our visual reading of those forms.
I think I would have liked to. I'd like to have seen it. I'm reading a sign over there with my eyes, and it says "wrap up." Yes. Thank you, everybody, for coming.